Okay, here we are, chapter 5, part 1. Read this verse. For I say, through the grace of God, even unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. And, of course, from Romans 12, verse 3. What does that verse mean to you? Well, when I read it, I feel that God is telling me, it's okay to feel good about yourself. In other words, be thankful, be blessed that you have the intellect to go to college and get a degree or get several degrees. It's okay to be able to have a job and earn money to support yourself and your family. But it is not okay to be conceited about it or about some gift that God may have given you. We need to realize we all have skills, we all have things we're good at, and then we have some things we're not so good at. When it comes to the area of intellectual disabilities, we should be careful and cautious not to talk down to people who may have a below average IQ or not to think we are better than that person. And remember, God loves everyone. And I have known children with intellectual disabilities who really brightened my day every time I saw them, and who lifted my heart and my spirit up every time I saw them. I wish I could do that for other people the way that some of those children can. That is a gift, that is a blessing. And so we should all be thankful that the world has a variety of people. Well, let's look at slide 3. This is kind of a little bit of a review, but you might remember from chapter 1, I told you that historically, even in the United States, people with disabilities, particularly severe physical disabilities or intellectual disabilities, people who were, say, moderately to severely, profoundly intellectually disabled, sometimes were abandoned by their families, sometimes put away in an asylum as though they were insane, although the person really was not insane. They were just a slow learner or had a below average IQ and needed help and support. Now, if the parents were very loving and caring and had patience, they may have taken care of the child at home. But in some cases, the child was kept at home because parents didn't want to have to pay to have a child in a hospital setting or something like that. And sort of hidden away when company came, and people barely knew the child existed, which is really sad. However, other children with intellectual disabilities were able to work for their families if they were at the, say, mild to moderate IQ level. We're going to talk about what those are in just a minute. But they could work. They were dependent on their families for a lot of things, in particular health care. And a lot of people with intellectual disabilities in the past did not live very long because of severe medical problems. An example of that would be someone with Down syndrome who was born maybe in the 1930s or 40s. Very seldom did such a person live into adulthood because usually they were born with multiple medical issues, and one big one was heart disease. And heart surgery was not quite as developed as what it is now, or the parents couldn't afford to take the child to a hospital and have heart surgery, especially if they lived in a rural area. So many times the child just died because we didn't have the advanced procedures we do nowadays. People, again, sometimes considered someone who had epilepsy and was intellectually disabled as being possessed or that they'd been cursed. So you can see there can be a lot of negative stigma against people who have intellectual disabilities. Fortunately, though, due to exposure and education, a lot of those stigmas have kind of gone away, which is a very wonderful thing. Let's look on slide 5 now. How do we determine if someone is intellectually disabled, that they have an IQ below 70? Well, there are a couple of tests that are mainly used in the United States. One is the Stanford-Binet, and one is one of the Wechsler test. And you asked me about those two in class because I'll give you a little bit of explanation about them and give you some examples. So be sure and ask me to do that in our next class. So if the child scores below 70 on two different tests, now why, you may ask, two different tests? Well, hey, all of us have gone at some point in our lives to school or college and we've taken a test on a day we didn't feel well. And if you could have taken that test maybe 3 days later, you'd have scored higher just because you physically felt better. So, psychologists try to determine if a child is ill or not the day that they come to give them an IQ test, of course, but there can be a lot of other factors. Mom and Dad could have had a big argument at home. Maybe I didn't get anything to eat last night. Maybe my teacher just fussed at me. Maybe I got in trouble on the bus and got a bus referral, so the child's not concentrating as well as they could on a test. Or maybe they just don't know or like this new psychologist person and don't really understand why the person took them out of their class. So all those things can be factors into why a child might not score as high as they could have. That's why school psychologists, by law, that's through IDEA and through state regulations, are required to test a child, usually on 2 different days, before saying that this child qualifies as intellectually disabled. Also, parents and teachers fill out some forms where they evaluate or rate the child developmentally. Now, those of you who are early childhood teachers will probably do this a whole lot more than those who are teaching middle school or high school, because children tend to get referred more when they're in elementary school, especially in the lower grades. Yes? Yes? False alarm. That was the hubby checking in on me. Okay, where were we? How to determine. Yes, IQ. Usually the child will be scoring far below average, significantly below average, and in special education that usually means 2 or more years below average, okay, developmentally, in things like self-help skills, ability to dress himself or herself, comb hair, make a light snack. In the case of a high school child, can the child use a microwave? Can the child prepare a simple meal or not? Can the child fill out a form, a job application? Balance a checkbook, all those kind of skills. Of course, a lot of adults don't have that one, right? But too much month left at the end of the money, as I like to say. So a lot of us could work on that one. But anyway, the teachers fill out forms indicating whether they think the child is average or below average in various skills, and the parent also fills out the same forms, because some things you're not going to know about a child. Only the parent would know. Such as, can the child bathe himself or herself at home, wash hair, get the hair combed or brushed right, and so forth. So the parent's going to know more about that usually than a classroom teacher. So after looking at all that, if the child scores still below 70 on the IQ and has below average developmental skills, then we have to make a determination on whether this child needs to be in a class for all or part of the day for children with intellectual disabilities. There are 3 levels that are recognized as being bona fide, if you will, in intellectual disabilities. Let's look at those 3. Let's go to slide 6. This is the lowest level, severely and profoundly disabled. You can see here, child has an IQ below 35. The child is very dependent on responsible adults. Child may or may not ever, note I say ever, be toilet trained. Okay? Child may or may not walk. That's known as being ambulatory. Child may be in a wheelchair. Child may be able to sit up or may only be able to sit up in a wheelchair when they have some pillows or what are known as bolsters around them, or him or her. Most of these children will be in a self-contained class, probably 80 to 95% of the day. They're going to be in a self-contained special education class for children with severe and profound intellectual disabilities. A lot of these children also have other medical problems. The ones who are most fragile may get a lot of respiratory infections and illnesses, and frankly that causes many of them to die. Their bodies are weak. They cannot fight off. They don't have the antibodies to fight off certain kinds of infections and germs and things, and many times the children die because of that, or heart conditions or kidney disease or something like that. But these children may also be in what's called a residential setting. In our area, we have the Coastal Center, which is over in Ladson on Miles Jamison Road, where children can live full-time into adulthood, and there are adults who live there who are severely intellectually disabled, been there most of their lives, or they may go for what's called respite care. Respite care means that the child or teen or adult goes and stays at Coastal Center over a weekend or for a period of a week or 2 weeks, and that gives the family some relief from the day-to-day care that they need to give to this child, all the changing of diapers and cleaning and feeding and so forth, and allows the family to maybe focus on their children who aren't disabled for a period of time and go do some things that are more difficult to do when you do have a child who is severely disabled. Next slide tells us about people who have moderate intellectual disabilities. And as you can see, the IQ usually is from about 35 to 49. Child may be able to learn to read and write a few simple words, learn to follow a very simple recipe. Some children even learn to do math up to about a 3rd grade level. May even learn to read a little bit from something like the newspaper. These students are usually in a self-contained class, and as an adult, they may live at home or they may live in some kind of group home where they have other adults, able-bodied, and adults with normal or above average IQs who supervise them in work settings and things like that. Now, in contrast to the children who are severely and profoundly disabled, those children, some of them will never speak. Some will never learn any words or any letters of the alphabet. Doesn't matter how old they are. And it's sad, but there are people like that. They are just not born intellectually capable of doing any kind of academic work other than very, very low-level skills. Children with the moderate intellectual disability, though, they are able sometimes to have simple jobs and work, sometimes in restaurants, work in garden centers, on farms, things like that, as long as they have a lot of supervision to make sure they don't injure themselves around any kind of equipment. Then you come to children who really may surprise you. The children who are mildly intellectually disabled, as you can see, their IQ is about 50 to 69, especially in elementary school, I would say. You may scarcely be able to pick these children out. In fact, when I started out teaching, back in the dark ages, back in the 1970s, children who were mildly intellectually disabled were often in regular class settings for most of the school day. And I had children who had IQs of 55 or 60, and they were in regular class most of the day and came to me for resource help in reading or math or both. Now, that doesn't happen quite as much as it used to because of all these standards and the testing and that kind of thing. But the children, I think, probably learned more because they were being exposed to the so-called, quote-unquote, normal child who would help them, learn to read and write and do some math. And they got exposed to a higher level of academics than they often do in some of the classes that are designed for them. Well, now these children usually end up in a self-contained class. But when they finish school, and keep in mind they can stay in school until they're what age? If you said 21, bingo, you're right. They may be very employable. So a lot of the time when they're in high school, they'll be learning some skills that they can use to go out in the job market and work somewhere. Some of them will live with family for most of their lives, or again, they may go to a group home. But some people, I know a lot of people myself who are mildly intellectually disabled who got married, have children, have jobs, and are running their households the best they can. And I've seen that happen. So don't be surprised when you think, what? You're telling me that child is mildly delayed? I really wouldn't have thought that. It's just a child that walks down the hall like any other one, and you really had no idea. So you'd be surprised. A lot of children with intellectual disabilities are very friendly and very social. And they've learned if I'm nice to people, they'll be nice to me. And if I'm nice to the teachers will help me more. And so they'll be the ones who will like to help do things like straighten up the classroom, help pass out materials, be the line leader, what have you. They enjoy all that and enjoy the social aspect of being around their non-disabled peers as long as they're not being bullied or picked on. Here's a question for you. My husband used to be involved in prison ministry up at Lieber Prison in Ridgeville, and he would tell me how many people he worked with there who were intellectually disabled or non-readers. People who just could not read, and they ended up in prison. So I want you to look on the internet and find you an article or two that talks about this. And come to class ready to talk about why you think so many people with disabilities end up in legal trouble. And what could our society do as a whole to help support people who are intellectually disabled, to help remedy that problem so they don't end up in jail. And I'm not going to talk about that too much right now. I want you to do some research and be ready to talk about it in our next class. All right, here we have something near and dear to the heart of every psychologist and psychiatrist, and a lot of special ed people like me, the bell curve. And of course, you know it's called that because, then this is the top part. This part is the bell curve, okay? Right up here where I'm drawing my little arrow along. What the bell curve purports to show is if we took 100 people at random and gave them an IQ test, this is how their scores would fall. Okay? 100 people chosen at random, given them an IQ test, and this is how we would think the scores would fall. Okay, now the two of the IQ tests I may have mentioned already, the Wechsler IQ test and the Stanford-Binet IQ test. And remember, we need to talk about those in class. So you be sure and ask me about those because you need to know a little bit about them, even if you are going to just be a beginning teacher. Well, let's go back up here and look at this bell curve. Okay, you'll notice one end of the bell curve, about less than 2.5% of people will be what is considered academically a genius. Okay, scroll down. According to Wechsler, IQ of about 130 up. Okay, so that means if we picked 100 people at random out of Northwoods Mall, okay, we would expect that 2 or 3 of them, given an IQ test, would score 130 or above. By the same token, we would expect that 2 or 3 people would score below 70. Okay, and you'll notice on the Stanford-Binet, they say 68, and for gifted, they say 132. But right now, we'll look at this one. So below 70, intellectually disabled. So you'd have 3 people way below average, significantly below average, and you'd have 2, 3 people far above the others. So where are most people falling? Well, hello, yes, in the middle. Okay, average IQ runs about 80, low 80s to 85, up to about 112, 115. When you get in here, and watch where I'm drawing, that from about 112 up to, maybe 128, something like that. That's considered having a high IQ, but you have to pretty much hit about 130 up to be considered gifted as far as IQ goes. So, most people fall between 70 and 130. And narrowing it down even more, most people, the majority of people, between 80 and 115. Now, how do I know that? Well, hello, do some math. I know it's hard, but do it. 34, look up here, 34 plus 34, what do you get? Okay, Einstein's, yes, 68.26. So about 68% of people fall in the average range. What is the perfect average IQ? Yes, 100. Whoops, let's go back. 100. There we go. That's considered the average IQ. Okay? Now, these other scores and things over here, you don't need to know that much about yet. But if you take any statistics classes when you're working on your master's degree, you might have to learn about z-scores and t-scores. What might interest you right now, though, is to think about what did you score on the SAT or if you took the ACT. And on one of those tests, what did you score? And then you can kind of look down here and then look up and see where you fall IQ-wise. Oh, you might like what you see or you might not. But keep in mind that was one test you took on one day. It's not necessarily representative of the rest of your life. So don't get discouraged by one test that you take on one day. Things can happen, and the Lord will provide. All right, let's move on. Controversy. In spite of decades of research by the folks who do the Wechsler and the Stanford Binet, and the way they've tried to norm these tests throughout the United States and the world, the way they've collected data, there still is a lot of controversy around the bell curve and IQ test. So do a little research on that and be ready to talk about that in class. Why is there controversy about using this test that's been used since, well, the beginnings of these IQ tests really started back about World War I in America. Why? Because World War I, they were having a huge influx of people coming into the Army. They had to be able to quickly test them and ascertain, okay, you are going to be the cook on the Navy ship. You are going to be a machine gunner. You can drive a tank. You have a good mechanical aptitude, so we're going to train you to fix tanks, airplanes, etc. You have a high IQ. We need people with high IQs to learn how to do coordinates so that we know where to drop the bombs. And we need people with very good fine motor skills and excellent physical health, vision, hearing, and good IQs to become pilots. Okay, so that's how IQ tests started in our country. But in those first few years, really first probably 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, the main group that was being tested were men for the military or men going to college. Well, then when women started getting out in the workforce more, they began to test more women. And we needed to see, okay, we've got men out here, we have women out here, and they're coming to college, and what are they going to be able to be successful in certain career paths. So that's why some group IQ tests were given. And you took group IQ tests when you were probably in 3rd grade and maybe again in 8th grade. If you were in a gifted and talented program for academics in school, you probably took a group IQ test, though you may not have known it at the time. And they went by that, and it usually has a fairly heavy weighting on whether you're going to be allowed into those gifted classes. The thing that used to get me, though, was, you know, we can only take, say, 30 people in this school in the gifted program. Well, here's someone who scored 1 point below. Maybe their IQ is 123 or something. But, we can only take people to 124. Is the person with an IQ of 124 really supremely smarter than the person with an IQ of 123? No, of course not. As I've already told you, you could test someone the next day, the next month, the next year, and their IQ may be higher or lower by approximately 10 to 12 points. That's called a standard deviation. Okay. Wechsler's standard deviation is about 10 to 12 points and kind of the same on the Stanford Binet test. Some people say 12 to 15 points on that. So in other words, if I scored an IQ of 100 today, I could take an IQ test next year and I might score anywhere from 85 up to 115. That's a big range, and it's average range, but that's a big range. So again, you don't want to place children or deny children placement in programs that might help them based on one IQ test. Really not a good thing to do. So just keep that in mind. And look for an article or two that may explain to you why there's a lot of controversy about the bell curve and the way tests are given and the way tests are written and developed. So we can talk about that some in class. Thanks for listening.